One of the things that you said that kind of struck me is you said that if you had known what you were going to face, the obstacles you were going to face, you might not have actually gone through with it. I think that kind of speaks to the whole ignorance is bliss thing. But at the same time, though, it feels like to me that one of the reasons why, you were able to fund it so quickly is at the time, like you said, just a couple of different conferences were kind of having tracks on the idea of podcasting. It was at New Media Expo. It was mentioned at Blogger, Blogger conference and things like that. But there wasn't truly a space for people who are sitting at home alone talking to their microphones to come out and get together. So tell me a little bit about those first conversations, like those first, let's do a conference. What was that like? You and Dan, you're just spitballing with each other. Like, how in the world did you decide it would be an actual conference rather than just another meetup?
Sure. We had attended New Media Expo, which you mentioned, and we had met a lot of people that were interested in podcasting, and podcasting was a very redheaded stepchild, small corner piece of that event. But the number of attendees that were at that event largely were interested in podcasting. And that struck me as, okay, here's people saying, why isn't there a podcast conference? And when you hear that multiple times, like, okay, I thought that too. That to me was an undeniable sign that there needed to be one. Whether it should have been Dan and I to start it, is irrelevant. We knew there should be one. We just kind of blindly jumped in and said, okay, let's go for it. And that was a learning process, to say the least. But we thought through as good as we could. We decided on Dallas for the first year. And one of the reasons we picked that is because that is a one-way flight for most U.S. cities in North America. And so Dallas seemed to be central. It seemed to be an easy place. There's kind of two major airports there. There's Dallas, Fort Worth, and there's Love Field. And so that's what we went with. And and then there was connections that we had from the podcast. Like, we'd interviewed people that had started other conferences and other niches. And we had conversations with those folks. We had a rapport with them, a friendship with them, where we could say, hey, if you were to start all over, knowing what you know now, what would you do? What would you avoid? So we got some really good advice for people that were just very generous and gracious with their time. They didn't charge us consulting fees. They were just friendly to us. And which I look back now and I realized, man, that was a gift. And we've certainly tried to pay that forward over the years. But it is interesting now that you're several years down the road, and there are a number of podcast conferences now. And it's funny because all the people that have gone off and started these podcast conferences are people that have come to Podcast Movement, and we just kind of laugh at that. It's like they're like, "Hey, I could do this," and then they go off and do their own version of it. So it's just creating more podcast conference opportunities, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But Podcast Movement kind of was the first one really to be inserted in that spot, and so I don't. We don't necessarily look at these other events as bad or competition or anything like that. We're pretty established at this point, but it is fun to see how Podcast Movement has added impact, not just in podcasting, but also in events for podcasting as well. So yeah, it's a lot's happened. So
it's truly become a movement. Mm-hmm. Is that why you chose?
Some say that, some don't. Yeah. Well, the name Movement, I've always loved that name. I remember in high school, there was a band. I grew up in Alabama. I grew up in the South, and there was a band called Far South Movement. I always thought that was a cool name. And then when talking to Dan about names for the event, there were so many names that were just played out. And we're like, we don't like that. That's cheesy. And we both, this is an interesting fact not many people know about us, but Dan and I both grew up wrestling fans. Dan was actually once a professional wrestler, by the way. And we loved wrestling. And at the time, there's a wrestler named Daniel Bryant who was doing this yes chant. And he would get in the ring and he would just raise his hands and the crowd would just go crazy. They'd say, yes, yes, yes. And I guess WWE coined that, the yes movement. And we were having a conversation one day and we started talking about that. And then it was like, hey, we should call it Podcast Movement. And then we were like, yeah, that's it. That's the name. So with that, I wish there was a better story of how we came up with it, but that's how we came up with it. So
I actually love that story though. That's fantastic.